Hi everyone. Going to do a series of short PowerPoints related to print advertising in the 1920s. And this first one is a general overview of some of the prominent themes that appeared in magazines and newspapers with advertising in the 1920s, way before the era of television, obviously. And print advertising was more primitive, probably would appear to you all, because in the 1920s it didn't involve photographs. Advertisements were illustrations done by commercial artists. But let's look at some of the themes that were prominent in advertising of the era. Person you see here, John Held, arguably the most influential commercial artist of the entire decade. Many of his illustrations, which appeared not only in advertisements but frequently on magazine covers like this one that you see from Life, a lot of the imagery Held created are things that people still have in their minds when they think about the 1920s. You see this couple here doing the Charleston, one of the popular dances of the era. So Held's style, which overall was pretty celebratory of the 1920s, although he slyly worked in some critiques of the 20s in his illustrations too. He had a sharp sense of humor and produced some work that was controversial for the time. Wouldn't be by our standards today, but was then. But visually, stylistically, his work was extremely influential. Here's an example, another magazine cover from McClure's that John Held did. This illustration is interesting for a number of reasons. It really highlights the change in women's fashions that had occurred in the 1920s. I would guess most of you have probably seen the old film Titanic. Saying it's old, it's from the 1990s. Do you think about that movie and how one of the main stars, Kate Winslet, and other women were dressed? That film was set in the year the Titanic sailed and sank, 1912, very much still the Victorian era, and women's fashions were extremely conservative. Long dresses, long sleeves, necks came up high, neckline. You might remember in that movie she gets reprimanded, I think it's by her grandmother at one point, for showing too much ankle with an outfit she's wearing. And here you can see the complete transformation that's happened in women's fashions by the 20s. Hemlines have come way up, necklines have plunged down. Sleeveless look was very popular, a lot more skin being shown than just a decade earlier. And you can see here too the change in women's fashion in terms of hairstyle, with the shorter bob look becoming much more popular. And in part that was due to people like the famous aviator Amelia Earhart. Was one of the first women to wear shorter kind of bobbed hair. Clara Bow, an actress of the 20s, contributed to that being popular as well. Slogans appeared in advertising in the 1920s, and this is still a part of advertising today. Coca-Cola example you see here, the pause that refreshes. And this was widely done with a number of products throughout the 1920s and proved to be a trend that has remained all the way to the present. Advertisers began using scare tactics. This is one of my favorites for Scott toilet tissue with this, you see a surgeon and surgical assistant here at work, some sort of serious surgery, it's implied, being performed with the trouble attributed to using the wrong type of toilet paper. These sorts of scare tactics became much more common and widespread with a variety of products in the 20s, and this too is something that you still see in advertising today. By our standards, the sexual overtones of advertisements in the 1920s would appear to most of you probably very tame or even non-existent. But visually, in the 1920s, advertising really began pushing boundaries. This is an example for Chesterfield cigarettes. And again, you may look at this and think it doesn't look like much is going on. But there's suggestiveness in the slogan used here, blow some my way. You've got the moonlight filtering through this woman's skirt. And in the context in the 1920s, this ad was pushing boundaries and was actually quite daring. It's interesting, too, because it shows women as being kind of full sexual beings, which wasn't entirely common in advertising in the 1920s, wasn't entirely common in literature. F. Scott Fitzgerald's work did that too, and that's a cultural change that's happened during the 1920s. But you can see some examples like this with Chesterfield cigarettes, where women are being shown as more complete humans and depicted as being outside some of the demure, reserved stereotypes that you had commonly seen in advertising before the 1920s. And we'll talk about in another PowerPoint some other examples of use of gender and depictions of women in advertising in the 1920s. But these are some of the major themes that you see emerging.